Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give everyone just one more minute for those that are just logging in now, and then we'll get started. Just to let everyone know, there will be some handouts that I'll put in the chat room at the end of the presentation after the Q&A, so feel free to download those. Good morning, ladies.
Morning.
Good morning.
Terrific. So we had a good response in registration. We'll just let a few more come in.
Welcome, welcome.
Exactly. Wonderful. Okay, I think in the interest of everyone's time, we'll get started. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this morning's webinar for hospitality operators and managers on managing your mental health. My name is Lori McIsaac, Director of Experiential Tourism with RTO9. You know, in prepping for this workshop, I was thinking back to when I worked in my family's restaurant and how I used to manage stress in those days where, you know, whether it was a customer or a colleague that just got under your skin. I used to go into the walk-in freezer and just let off a little steam, scream my little heart out, wait until I was too cold to stay in there any longer, and then I came out. The pandemic has ushered in a whole new level of concern for owners and managers, and today's webinar is going to dive a little deeper into recognizing and managing your mental health. So a few housekeeping notes: this webinar will be recorded and made available on our industry website within a few days. Our website is rto9.ca. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat room and I will table them on your behalf. So Not 9 to 5 is a nonprofit global leader in mental health advocacy for the food and beverage sector. Through practical education and meaningful community building, they are reimagining the hospitality industry by breaking stigmas and fueling hope. After decades as a hospitality professional and struggling with her own experiences with anxiety, depression, trauma, and grief, Hassel Avalas was inspired to co-found 9 to 5, a nonprofit that empowers food service workers like herself. As executive director, she has made it her mission to provide mental health and substance use support by mobilizing educational resources and advocating for psychological safety. Hassel's strategy, planning abilities helped grow not 9 to 5, from a series of workshops, panels, and webinars into a global vehicle for change. She aspires to start a worldwide hospitality revolution to create work environments that are inclusive and proactive rather than top-down and reactive. Hassel, give us a wave. And joining Hassel is Laura Louise Green. Laura is a licensed professional counselor and organizational consultant from Chicago, Illinois. After working in the hospitality industry for nearly 20 years, Laura utilizes her knowledge and skills as a trained and licensed mental health professional to facilitate training, growth, and healing within the hospitality sector. She studied at DePaul University, earning a Master's of Education in Community Counseling, and is currently studying for her second master's, way to go, Laura, this time in organizational psychology at Birkbeck University in London in the School of Business, Economics and Informatics. Welcome, ladies. I'm going to turn my camera off and let you both take over, and I'll come back during the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you for having us.
Much, Lori. That was wonderful. It's always a little bit awkward to hear your own bio, but I'm trying to ease into the comfort of that, you know?
It is. Be proud of it. You gotta be proud of it.
I am so proud. So proud to be here with you today, Laura. So full transparency, Laura and I have done this before. We've done a few presentations like this before. And I always like to say that because it's, I think for me, it's like part of it is just that there has been such a camaraderie going through even pre-pandemic being in this industry. But then obviously in the last couple of years, I really feel like we've grown, grown closer and really had to draw on a lot of our own experiences to get through the last couple of years. So for today's presentation, I couldn't think of a better person to present with So Laura, I'm so excited that we get to do this together.
Right back at you. So happy to be here.
In terms of hospitality employers, managers, anyone in a leadership position, this presentation is for you. And all of this work was, put together with you in mind. And if we could just flip to the next slide, we will start. Sorry. So that's me, not 9 to 5, but we already read our bios. The next slide is Laura, Healthy Poor. And also full transparency, Not 9 to 5 is traditionally located in Toronto. Today I'm coming at you from London in the UK, where I'm on a bit of a tour, but I wanted to also share that, Laura, let us know where you're coming from.
I'm in Chicago right now. Sunny Chicago. That was a joke. It's not sunny here at all.
Is it full winter?
No, it's that false spring that keeps like tugging at my heartstrings and faking me out. And then just, yeah. But hello from Chicago, everybody.
I feel like in Ontario, we're stuck in that too. It's spring.
Mhm.
Just kidding. No, it's not. Still more snow.
Psych.
Psych. So, this slide for me is the beginning. It's basically, I wanted to share a little bit about the fact that we are both in the same position as you if you're a business owner or if you're in a leadership position. I run a nonprofit organization, and being in this kind of leadership position in the last couple of years has been one of the most challenging experiences of my life. Trying to manage a team, trying to manage my own emotional experiences, my own mental health. I really just wanted to just put that out there as in I'm here with you. And Laura, I know you wanted to say a little bit about that too.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, running a business and having people rely on you and in the midst of so much uncertainty, it's truly a stress that I've been teaching about stress for many years. And this is a stress that I have never experienced before. And I want to say that both Hassel and I, we get it. Like, we get it. And it's very, very hard. It's also easier to talk about what we should do than actually doing it. And even things that we're presenting today are things that I know I can certainly speak for myself that I still struggle with. Like when I grabbed my water, I said to myself out loud, you cannot survive on coffee alone, Laura. So it is an ongoing process, and we recognize that a lot of this is easier said than done, but we also have to say it to eventually do it. So be kind to yourself throughout this conversation. Take what you want from it, whatever sticks, hold on to it, and like this is being recorded, so you can always come back to it as well.
I love that so much, Laura. I'm always telling myself little things around like what I need to do, or I'll prompt myself, will this help me right now? Will it? Or will it harm me?
Yeah, and also I want to share that like change takes time. And not to divulge too much about my life, but I used to be like solid athlete, like triathlete, and then the pandemic happened and I was like, ooh, freedom to do nothing. And now I'm trying to come back to a space where I can, feel athletic again and feel good in my body again. And I've started on this, workout journey, like back to training and everything. But what I've really experienced in this time, combined with the stress and changing for me to be able to integrate working out and health and my like physical well-being into my life, it takes so much incremental change. And it's not just incremental change around like starting to run faster on the treadmill or lifting heavy weights. It's also about like, okay, how's my day structured? Can I really go to the gym in the middle of the day? Do I have time to go to the gym in the middle of the day? Probably not. Okay, maybe I should try to go in the morning. So I'll go to the 7:15 class, but then I'm out at 8:15 and I have meetings and all of these different pieces. So I have to make all of these micro changes over the span of weeks. Like it's been 6 weeks that I've been making these changes, finally to get to the point that I'm at the gym at 5 a.m. But that means I had to change my nighttime schedule. I had to change when I eat. if I'm having a drink at the end of the night or not, how many. So all of these things take time to change. And what we want you to know is when we talk about mental health and well-being, there are so many factors coming in that's affecting it all the time. It's never just one thing, and there's definitely no silver bullet in terms of addressing it. Now, even though there's not a silver bullet, we are focusing primarily on stress today, because stress is probably the most brutal part of what we're experiencing now. And as long as we are as stressed as we are, we can't address the other things.
Absolutely. The only thing I wanted to add on top of that is that I think managing your stress is part of managing your mental health, right? So they're so interconnected. If you can learn how to do one, it impacts the other. And so I think that's why you'll hear us mention stress so much, because it is interconnected with your mental health. And I really want to acknowledge as well that, you know, in the last couple months and or years, however it looks like for you, it just keeps adding on more and more in different ways. So that takes us to the next slide. And as well, our first poll. So we're going to be running some polls throughout this presentation. If you could participate, we would be immensely grateful. We put a lot of thought into why we asked, what we ask and when we ask it. So are you doing anything right now to attend to your mental health? Yeah, out of curiosity, in terms of all the stress that we're feeling and what you're experiencing with your mental health, if you could answer that question, it'd be really good for us to think about. I think as well, we're going to move into the definition of stress. Before I pass it to you, Laura, and you're going to get us into the more technical definitions of stress, I wanted to highlight something that I often heard, I'm still here actually in my career, and especially in hospitality. You know, it's such a passion-driven industry. It's such a passion-driven sector, food service, hospitality, restaurants, you know, hotels, tourism, however you define it, however it looks like for you. You often hear people say, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And I just want to highlight that that's simply not true. It really doesn't apply to our industry, and it's harmful. It's really, really harmful. You know, it's up there with, I would put it in the same category as toxic. Oh, excellent. Wow. I love seeing these results.
Really impressed. Great work. Yeah.
Wow. Applause to all of you. I am so impressed. I think that, you know, those that put no, 20%, I feel you. I hear you. That's me quite often sometimes, even when I know what I'm supposed to do, what I have to do. I don't. We're human. It happens. You're not alone. But going back to that quote, you know, I feel like the doing what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. It's so toxic to me, and it's so harmful to me, and it adds so much stress. Overwork, you know, it starts to justify overwork. And I feel like that is one of the most harmful aspects of that saying. You know, passion is wonderful. I'm a very passionate person, but I can't use that to justify overworking. And, you know, all of us have passion and drive, and in this industry, that is absolutely, you know, a great, wonderful thing. But it can come at a high cost to our mental health, and it can often lead to exploitation. And as Laura, as you reminded me as well, it can also lead to self-exploitation. I think sometimes we don't realize how we're talking to ourselves about stress and about our work ethic, or how many hours we're working. And so I just wanted to highlight that before we jump into the technical definition of stress.
Yeah, thanks for that, Hazel. Yeah. Oh my gosh, my phone starts ringing. Honest to Pete.
You're so popular, Laura.
Before 9 a.m. Oh my Lord. You know, but with that, you know, with that, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. It's one thing to tell yourself, I'm very thrilled and happy and sometimes lucky that I get to do the work that I want to do, but that doesn't mean that there aren't boundaries around what that is. Like, there's always going to be work to do, but it's part of our job as leaders is to put boundaries around our work so that we can continue to exist and thrive, so that we can do what it is that we love to do. But stress. So what is stress? It's a term that's thrown around a lot. How are you doing today? I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed. And it's often a word that's even used for other emotions that we're feeling. Like if I'm sad or angry, oh, I'm stressed, and that's, yes, there's stress embedded in those emotions for sure. But stress is, you can read the definition here, but it's any type of change that causes physical, emotion, or psychological strain. So it's when we are experiencing something that we don't currently have the skills, the emotional skills or the physical skills to deal with. It could be like a bear is running at you. I've never run away from the bear. So my body is going to be like, oh snap, there's a bear, I better do something. And then my body and my brain kicks into hyperdrive, and everything in my system, both cognitively and physically, everything goes towards survival, like just survival. So in terms of my cognition, my focus changes in a way that I would call pinhole focus. So like if you were to take like a sheet of paper and poke a hole and hold it up, you can only see through that pinhole and everything else is blocked off. That's how your focus starts to get. So it's like hyper focus, but nothing else. Because of this, your emotional systems start to really simplify. So any sort of emotion that you're comfortable with, that's where you go to in a high energy situation. So if you're really comfortable with your anger is going to be turned up to 11 and nothing else is going to be there. Like your emotional nuance it's over out the window. That's why when we're stressed, we get really irritable with people, or sometimes we break down and start like to become especially sad or introverted. It's because our emotional processes are simplifying, because our brains are saying survive, survive, survive. And there's not energy in there to do anything else. So those are some of the mental things. That also means that like mental fatigue kicks in really quick if we have prolonged stress. Our stress systems are really there to only last like 10 minutes. So if we have prolonged stress for any longer than that, like enough to get away from a bear, if we have stress longer than that, it really starts to fatigue our systems. That's when we start to get tired. We lack focus. We can't multitask at all. We start to forget things. On a physical level, our adrenaline shoots up. That's when you see like mothers lift cars to save their children. Cortisol shoots up. Our heart rate increases. We start sweating. But that really leads eventually, if we have this prolonged state of stress, to adrenal fatigue. And that's also why we see stress becoming so terrible in terms of what it does to our bodies. It's because we're living in it longer than we're designed to be able to live in it. But if we could go to the next slide, stress isn't a bad thing and it gets a bad rap. It's just like, it's like water, right? We need water to live and we need to drink it to live. But if there's too much of it, we might drown. I'll hand it over to you, Hassel.
Absolutely. I think, thank you for that, Laura. I think that so oftentimes, you're so right, it has such a bad rep. It gets, gets put in this category as a negative. And truly, like a lot of these things, like many things in life, they're not binary. It's not good or bad. You can't just categorize it that simply. It's much more complex than that. There's so many different layers to it. I can tell you, even for example, for this presentation, I always get stressed out. I always get anxious and nervous for these presentations. I live with anxiety, really often social anxiety, specifically performance anxiety. So this for me is exposure therapy, and it really helps me to have this kind of stress. It actually is what gets me through the experience. Doesn't mean that I necessarily always feel great in the moment, but I always feel great after, and I think that experiencing stress and learning how to manage it can, like I said, really impact your mental health. So with me, for example, my stress can help me manage my anxiety. Obviously, if it gets out of control, that's a different story. That's a totally different experience. But if I can do certain things to manage it then I can increase my capacity for experiencing it. So that's what I would just add to the benefits of stress. And I think we should go to the next slide. So noticing when and how we experience stress can act as a map of our needs. So for me, again, going into a bit of personal experience, it's really helpful for me to learn what happens and how I feel when I experience stress and identifying patterns. So, for certain people, this is something that kind of happens and they don't really take note of the patterns. And I've found that actually identifying, understanding, and being able to note that, write that, acknowledge it, however it is that I'm learning it for myself, it actually helps me respond to it. So the more that I understand it, the more that I learn how to identify it, the more I can take mental notes or physical notes, if that's how, if that works for you. Some people use journals, some people, have different ways of managing these things. For me, certain feelings in my body, I've now started to understand mean certain things. The more that I can label it, the more that I can, when I'm experiencing, the more that I can take the moment to acknowledge it and label it for myself, the easier it is for me to respond in that moment. I can also tell myself things like Laura was talking earlier about, like drinking water. In these moments, I can tell myself that it's natural that I'm experiencing this kind of stress and anxiety, and it's okay. It's a presentation. It's not a bear. As Laura was talking about being chased by a bear, in this moment, I am not being chased by a bear, but it feels that way to me. Like it really naturally in my body feels just as terrifying as if I was being chased by a bear. So learning how to understand that and identify it has helped me respond to it. The last thing I'll say on this slide is just that noticing these little, mental notes or these observations about myself, these indicators, they always teach me something about what I have or don't have, what I need or don't need in these moments. I don't want to eliminate the stress. As uncomfortable as it is uncomfortable, I'm not going to lie, but learning to lean into that discomfort and learning to acknowledge that sometimes when I'm feeling stressful, it means that there's something that I don't have that I need in that moment. And learning what that is and taking the time to reflect has been extraordinarily helpful. Laura, did you want to add anything to that?
I am going to add something to that. So Hassel, you mentioned earlier that you have like performance anxiety, and I'm going to just talk very briefly about our emotional lives in terms of energy and needs. So if we are high energy and our needs are being met, that becomes excitement. If we are high energy and our needs are not being met, that's anxiety. So it's the same level of energy, but on one hand, there's a feeling of security when our needs are being met, so we're able to be excited as opposed to anxious. Now, if we have low energy and our needs are being met, that's contentment. If we are low energy and our needs are not being met, that's depression. So keeping that in mind of when we are feeling certain challenging emotions, it's usually because there's something is not being met, So when we are stressed, what that's creating is immense energy in our body. Again, it's to like fight or flight, get away, dukes up, whatever. So any emotion that's with that is going to be a high energy emotion. And if you find your anxiety kicking into high gear, that's usually because there's some need that's not being met. And if your stress is even showing up at all, that's because you don't have in that moment what you need, but it gives you an opportunity to learn it. If you're like, I always get stressed when this happens, then you can say, I got some work to do there. But we can, I think, go ahead to the next slide and talk about different kinds of stress that we experience. So a few different kinds of stress we're looking at here. Acute stress, it's not adorable, it's just quickly onset. Every time I say it, I'm like, acute stress. But it means it's sudden. It's on, it comes on all at once. It's a sudden event, either like, it could be, you know, you're in your restaurant and a table gets knocked over and it's like, boom, stress. Or it could be something like you have a big life change. Maybe you're going through a divorce, or you lose someone, or you're having trouble with, you know, you have a fight with a partner or something. The stress that comes from those things, it's sudden, it's unexpected, well, you know, interpersonal, whatever, but it comes on quickly. Episodic stress
Well,
is what,
Laura, sorry to
yes,
interrupt you, Laura. I had here in the notes as well that you mentioned, and I think this is very relatable, when restaurants were closed,
yes.
when that was imposed on us.
Yes. So actually, thank you for that, Hassel, because we've all been through all of these phases of stress in the pandemic. And the acute stress is like, oh, we're going to close all the restaurants. When all the restaurants closed, I was in Amsterdam and I was so excited to eat all that good food. And they were like, nope, all the restaurants are closing at 4:30. I landed at 4 o'clock and I was like, oh, and that was a stressful time. And I walked through the canals and I saw all of these restaurant managers and chefs freaking out. It was like, oh no. So that's a sudden onset acute stress. Sorry, I'm sure that's loud. Give me one moment. I'm so sorry. Focus, do not disturb. Boom. Episodic stress is when we experience acute stress over and over and over again. So an example of that in the pandemic would be when they kept opening and closing the restaurants. Like, oh, you're open. Oh, you're kind of open. Oh, actually, you're not open. Oh, you're open again. Oh, you need to get all this stuff. Oh, everyone should be in masks. No masks. Like, over and over and over again. And that becomes problematic because we don't have time to adapt. We don't have time to grow. So it's just stress on stress on stress, just hiking itself up again and again and again. Chronic stress is similar to episodic stress, but without those spikes. So it's like an ongoing stress that's like constant. I think it was, I don't know, it's some horror movie that they had bees buzzing in the background in the soundtrack to like heighten people's anxiety. That's what, like, I can't remember what movie, The Shining, I don't know, one of those, but in the soundtrack there was like this low level buzz, and it's to like heighten anxiety and anticipation. And that's what chronic stress feels like to me, just that constant like oppressive, like thick air all the time. And that can look like, how am I going to care for my employees? How am I going to pay my bills? Am I going to have my house next year? Like all of these really big sort of looming stresses that we don't really have a lot of control over, that creates chronic stress. So episodic stress and chronic stress, I think you can see how they're related, but different. Post-traumatic stress now is stress that reemerges after there's emotional damage or emotional bruising. So I'm traumatized from this pandemic, and every time I was just listening to NPR and there was this story about how there's a new variant. I think it's called Deltacron or something, and I'm even saying it out loud. I felt this internal, like my emotional life just went like, ooh. And that's an example of post-traumatic stress. It is something that is triggered by an event that has happened in the past that has not been dealt with or fully healed. Post-traumatic stress can present itself as a replication of what has happened, or like a sort of echo of it, or it can be in like other ways that are sort of like adjacent to it that we don't really expect. I also want to say, in all of this, there is a difference between experiencing post-traumatic stress and having like post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also acute stress disorder. Again, it's not an adorable stress disorder, it's a sudden onset stress disorder. And when we talk about disorders like this, what we're saying is that the emotional experience that you're having and the stressful experience that you're having is impeding on your relationships, it's impeding on your ability to work, and it's impeding on your ability to thrive. So those are like I would say the basic diagnostic criteria that we use. So you might be experiencing post-traumatic stress, but that doesn't mean it's a disordered thing. Post-traumatic stress is a very natural thing to experience after a trauma. When it becomes disordered is when we really have to intervene and we start to like turn into a treatment. So I encourage you to really think about, is my stress impeding on my day-to-day life? Am I not able to ever sleep? Am I having nightmares? Am I crumbling from the stress? I'm always encouraging people to talk to someone and address their, just to address their emotional life and to build skills around things. But if you are experiencing those things like nightmares, I would definitely take some time to talk to someone. But yeah, those are the difference between disorders and, the sort of run-of-the-mill stress, even though the run-of-the-mill stress still sucks.
Yeah, it does.
I
think I really appreciate the breakdown, Laura, because I feel that, sometimes you hear these kinds of definitions and, you just think, or I've heard other people say, I don't need to learn about that because it doesn't affect me, that I don't experience that, for example. That's not me, that's not my experience. But I just want to highlight that I think it's important to acknowledge and know as much information on these topics as possible if you're in a leadership position. Because in that situation, you're responsible for so many people, so many different kinds of people in your workplace. So I think it's really vital for leaders, managers, owner operators, what have you, to know as much as possible, really, truly, on these topics, especially right now. I mean, the pandemic is a collective trauma. There is so much collective grief associated to what we've experienced, even in our own hospitality industry. Across Canada, we've lost over 10,000 restaurants. Probably more from now. That was a stat from 2021. To over 250,000 workers have left the industry. There's a lot of grief around that. I know even me myself, I've lost so many of my favorite places to eat or to dine at or to visit or to drink or to where I celebrated my weddings or important anniversaries, and now they're just gone. And there's a lot of grief around that. So I want to highlight that the reason why we're going into some technical and lived experience, like there's both here for you, is because you're in a leadership position, you're an employer. So you have a lot of other people that have different versions of the same story around you. And even though you yourself may not experience some of these specifics, I guarantee folks around you are. And the more you know, the better, you can make decisions that are informed decisions. So I just wanted to add that to what you were saying, Laura. I think we can go to the next slide. Emotional bruising. Do you want to start? Do you want me to start? It's so.
I can go. I can start with this one.
You go first.
Coming back in line with the post-traumatic stress, emotional bruising is when we have something happens to us or around us, or we witness something that causes emotional distress that requires some healing. So I call it emotional bruising. Think of it like if, I don't know why this image came to my mind, but like you get hit in the arm with a baseball, whatever, a rogue baseball. And it leaves this big bruise. You have to give it time. You have to give it time to heal. But the interesting thing about when we have a bruise or an injury of some kind is that, like, yeah, if we poke it, like, that hurts. But sometimes, like, if I won't even touch it, but I'll move my arm and that hurts, or I'll move like this and it hurts. So when we have this emotional bruising, not only do we need to give it time to heal, but we're going to feel it in ways that we might not expect. It's not like every time you see a baseball, you're like, it might come up in other ways. This is also why, like, emotional intelligence is so important. Just taking note of where your stress lies and how you're feeling all the time. Those are all indicators of what your life is and what you need. I'll hand it over to you, Hassel, from there.
Thank you, Laura. I also love this note you made about stop poking the wound. Because I think we do that sometimes to ourselves or to each other. And it's such a good reminder to think of it as a wound. I think so oftentimes we're so much more understanding and compassionate when it comes to physical injuries. We're so much more well-informed when it comes to physical safety. There's so much more capacity to have patience around, physical healing. And I always like to emphasize that the same, absolute same, sometimes even more, is needed for mental and emotional injuries. Emotional healing, mental injuries, emotional bruising, however you want to call it, it's the same concept. And this idea of, if you have something like what we've experienced in the last couple of years and months and weeks, depending on who you are and where you live in the world, there's just so much happening, and it just keeps happening over and over in different layers. So understanding that, having compassion for that in the same way you would for a physical injury. We give people workplace accommodations for if they get in a car crash or something happens to them, they have a heart attack, they have diabetes, whatever, the case may be. And I think we really need to start educating ourselves more and having the same attention and focus, especially as employers, for our employees and what they're experiencing, in terms of their mental health. Sorry about that. That was my reminder. So that was the only thing I wanted to add to emotional bruising. I think we can go to the next slide.
I will add to, Hazel, something that you said yesterday really stuck with me about how quickly
Oh, yeah.
happen, but how long it takes to heal. And it's true for our emotional, like if there is a car accident, let's say, that happens in a split second, but there might be a long road of healing ahead. And the same is true for our emotional lives. And it's an opportunity to provide ourselves with some grace and some compassion, and it's important to remember that if we've experienced something, like a global pandemic that is especially scary or traumatic, that even though we're reopening there is a degree of needing to be like full speed ahead, make up for lost time, do take time to be like, I need to, find some corner of your life where you can practice a little bit of healing.
Yeah, it's so true. Thanks for that reminder, Laura. So in terms of coping, I think we had a poll for this slide. See if it comes up. Here we are. Are you aware of your coping skills and mechanisms? Please select one of the following. Oh, there's 5. Excellent. I think sometimes, it's interesting in terms of self-reflection what we are aware of or not aware of. And I am curious to see the results of this one. Laura, did you want to add anything to this poll?
To the poll, no. I think I'm good on the poll. Or so I guess we can, there we go. Perfect. Oh, awesome.
A lot going on there. Okay.
About half the time, some of the time. That's perfect. Yeah, so becoming aware of our coping skills and mechanisms, awareness is like the pathway towards being able to control these things more. And since coping is like this ongoing process that helps the mind and body mitigate the effects of stress, it is like an ongoing in and out all the time process that we are either aware of or we might be unaware of. They're either intentional coping skills or automatic coping mechanisms. So from there, I think we can go to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, so ways that we cope. I've already mentioned that coping skills, those are our more intentional things that we do, and coping mechanisms are the more automatic pieces. But the ways we cope are also quite varied. One way to think about it is adaptive coping, and the other way is maladaptive coping. Adaptive coping is when we are able to confront the stressor. So whatever is causing us stress, we're able to say, I see you. How do I work around this, or how do I build the skills in order to address it so this stressor is no longer stressful? Either it's removed or it's addressed. Maladaptive coping is when we kind of press pause for a second. So if y'all have ever watched like How I Met Your Mother, and whoever those characters are, when they get into a fight and it like starts to escalate, either one of them can be like pause, and it gives them a chance to de-escalate, and then they return to the fight when they're able to like talk calmly. That's what maladaptive coping is. So it's really just like a pause, like a chill in the moment so that you can address it when you get to it. An example of that might be like, there's a service and it's like, it's flying off the rails. It is getting wild. And you in that moment cannot be like, oh, we should totally redevelop the system of how we do our seating patterns. Like, that is not the time to do that. At that point, you're just in there being like, I'm going to help bus some tables. I'm going to run around. I'm going to see, does anyone need this? Do you need this? Did I expo? What can I do to help? It's like this sort of like, I'm not going to go through and like work through it and problem solve in there. With adaptive coping, that's when you go back to it and you say, okay, what happened here? And how do we fix it? So adaptive coping and maladaptive coping, neither are better or worse than the other. The problem that we run into is when we are consistently maladaptively coping, when we never actually address it. So if the stress comes again and again and again, then that turns into a little bit of a problem. These next 3 slides, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper to how to cope with stress, and they go from immediate short term, and then we'll move into more long-term solutions for your stress. But I'll hand this over to Hassel.
All right, so regulating your nervous system, I think is something that is very, I feel like it's underrated, like it's undervalued. I feel like we don't talk about this enough, specifically in the hospitality and food service sector. When we're stressed, we know we're so often in a survival mode, just focusing on the light at the end of the tunnel, getting through. You know, there's physical and cognitive responses going on, and sometimes we can't cope if our nervous system is not regulated, and we can't make certain decisions. And you know, some people would say, oh, I can't, like, you know, I'm not making rational decisions or something. There's a lot of science behind this. So as it turns out, you know, there's different parts of our brains that do different things. There's like emotional parts of our brains. There's like the cognitive, like smart parts of our brain. There's the survival parts. And one thing I learned, you know, a few years ago in learning more and more about trauma is that there's a window of tolerance. And specifically, so first of all, when I say trauma, this is another word that's like stress. It gets thrown around and used, you know, every other day for whatever reason. And I think that sometimes that's a good thing, and I think sometimes that's not helpful because it's misunderstood. So, you know, there's so many different definitions of trauma out there right now. 2 that I really like to go to. One is by Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a Canadian, you know, writer, author, doctor from BC. He defines trauma as a loss of connection to oneself and to the present moment. He also defines trauma as not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us. And I think, you know, that's a very broad, vague definition. Another way Peter Levine defines it as trauma is our ability to respond to a perceived threat that is in some way overwhelmed. All of these different definitions, you know, we can experience so many different kinds of trauma. That's the other thing, is I think sometimes people think, oh no, I haven't experienced trauma, because they think trauma is just like a natural disaster or a war zone or, you know, something specific. But I think other less obvious versions of trauma can be, you know, feeling neglected. You know, certain loud noises can traumatize certain people, extreme heat or cold. For those racialized people, there's systemic injustice that can really make you feel traumatic, or societal pressures for others. You know, all of this affects our ability, you know, to experience things, to make decisions, and affect our nervous system. And specifically on the nervous system bit, there's this term, window of tolerance or window of resilience. There's two different, schools of how they name it. And that is a state. So window of resilience is a state of optimal arousal where we can function with effectiveness. So what that means is that you're not in hyperarousal, which is too much, or hypoarousal, which is too little. And examples of those two things, one for hyper, for example, you can experience things like increased sensations of things, intrusive images, hypervigilance. I've seen a lot of that in the hospitality industry. Hypoarousal is the opposite, where you feel numbed out, you have poor boundaries, you're shut down. Ideally, you want to be kind of in the middle, which is what they call this window of tolerance. And in order to get there sometimes I would say, the only way to get there is to regulate your nervous system. And, this is something that unfortunately is not taught in school. It's not taught in the workplace often enough. And there's different ways to do it. There's one of the handouts actually talks about a specific tool on how to do it. But there's many different ways, and there's many different tricks or tips or ways to get there. But I really wanted to explain that in order to sometimes make these decisions, like Laura was saying, there's maladaptive and adaptive. In order to get to the one that's going to help you the most with managing your stress and managing, what you're experiencing, the only way to get there is often to regulate your nervous system.
It's kind of like in the Titanic. I'm just full of pop culture today, y'all. But in the Titanic, when it went down and Rose is like on her door, ideally the ship doesn't sink, right? That's the first ideal thing. But the second ideal thing is that you have a lifeboat. But if all you can get is a door, take the door. Sometimes we want to get to the lifeboat, but sometimes we need the door to get us to a point that we can get on a lifeboat. Regulating your nervous system is Rose's door. So, or a chair or a barrel or whatever. It's just the thing that gets you.
Yeah, and like I said, it looks different for everybody. For some folks, I've found meditation is how they get there. For other folks, they have different breathing techniques that they need to get there. Other people use cold exposure treatments. Even just holding ice can help you kind of snap out of what you're feeling and help you come back to the moment so that you can make different kinds of decisions for yourself. Let's go to the next slide. There's some other couple examples for reducing the effects of stress in the moment. Laura, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, so the shake it off, when we're experiencing stress and our energy is like through the roof. I don't know if you've ever, well, of course, we've all seen a dog shake. The reason that they shake is because they're shaking their stress away. So like every time my dog, who's sleeping right here, shakes, I'm like, good shake off, Barley, because I know that he's like managing his stress. I want to encourage him to do that because he's just like getting all the energy out. And we can do the same thing. If we wash our hands, just give it a quick shake. In that same vein, progressive muscle relaxation does the same thing. So like squeezing and tensing your muscles, you can do it with your toes, with your legs, with your hands, and then just relaxing. It helps just do that. There's also square breathing, which is like breathe in for 4, hold it, breathe out for 4, hold it at the bottom, breathe in for 4, and so on and so forth to keep doing that, and it'll bring you down. You can actually excite yourself into anxiety, which also means you can bring yourself out of it too. And then finding a calm place, like Lori mentioned, the walk-in is a space where people go, but also with your nervous system, a way to regulate your nervous system is also to plan ahead. So eating well, exercising, meditating when you're not at work, finding ways, if you are able to like keep a chill thing going when you experience stress, it might not be up here, it still might be here, but at least it's not up here. So doing things ahead of time, also, maybe cutting back on your coffee I mean, good luck, but like, it's a thing. It's definitely a thing. I get it. I'll hand it back to you, Hazel.
I love that. I think it's so true, though. I think that oftentimes when we feel something, we're just reactive to it. And I think what you're highlighting, Laura, right now is the really big, important emphasis to be proactive about these things. Because you're so right, Laura. All of these things, if you've eaten today, how you slept last night, you know, if you drank alcohol or, you know, consumed other substances the night before, or even 2 days ago, all of these things impact, you know, your whole entire nervous system, your physical, your mental, your emotional. All of us have different things that we need, and that some of us, you know, are affected more than others with specifics. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I think for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, there's all kinds of other things that happen that affect your nervous system. I'll get more into that later. But, you know, you cannot disregard the reality of these stressors. And in the hospitality industry, I think too oftentimes we don't necessarily verbally acknowledge these things or build, you know, the acknowledgement into the way we operate our businesses. So a lot of it is reactive. And so I think the emphasis for this is for you as a person, as an individual, and then also for you as an employer. You know, we have, as an employer, you have a duty to accommodate people. So if people come to you with certain requests for place accommodations that they need, or even ideas, you know, in terms of psychological safety, part of psychological safety is being able to receive feedback, is being able to get input from your team. So a lot of these things, you know, the more that you can role model and do this yourself, the more that it ends up seeping out into the workplace, I find, which ultimately helps everyone, from your individuals on your teams to even, you know, the sustainability of your business and profitability of your business. The more sustainable and well adapted your team is, the more sustainable and well adapted your business is. So ultimately, a lot of what we're talking about here, it isn't just a nice to have, it isn't just a feel good, you know, good for you, pat yourself on the back thing. It's also something that has an incredible return on investment when we're talking about workplace mental health. So, and I always like to highlight that it's all interconnected. You know, drinking a glass of water, it's not, you know, it's not just something that's good to do because it feels good. It also, everything you do as a leader, as an owner operator, has an influence. And especially in our industry where we're still so influenced by the brigade system of this, you know, chain of command and everything coming down from leadership. I think it's always really important to be aware of how what we're doing impacts everyone around us.
Absolutely.
I think we can go to the next slide here.
Yeah, so a few examples of coping maladaptively. So this is like if you get to the door and then like you're floating to a lifeboat situation. So this could look like compartmentalizing or avoiding the problem, of like, we can't address this right now. It's just, we're just going to have to let it fly off the rails and fix it later. You know, comp some tabs, you know, like that's just what it's going to have to look like. This can also, though, look like misattributing the problem. Then this is another form of avoidance of like, well, it's not our problem, it was the host, you know, and thinking like, oh, this is not something that we have to address. This was this person right here. It's a way that makes us feel better about our stress, and it, you know, that's a form of coping, but it's not really the best form of coping. It can also cause some interpersonal damage, and, you know, as a leader, it's not really great to like point fingers at people when really it's always some form of the organization. And then another way, probably the most common way that we can cite, is numbing emotional responses with substances. So you're in a really stressful situation, you're like very emotional and your stress is through the roof. I know that the first thing I'm like, ooh, I would like to open a bottle of wine to deal with this. And maybe I'm going to watch Love is Blind on Netflix and just like numb out and not even think about it. And then hopefully you come back to it. But again, what starts to happen is we don't come back to it, and the problems are never addressed. And that's when we start to see that chronic stress come through. But coping maladaptively can get us to that next step that we can cope adaptively. So if we could go to the next slide. So coping adaptively could look like processing the stress with a friend, loved one, or a professional like a therapist or a coach, or whomever, of like, I'm experiencing this stress. There is a difference here between like venting to a friend and processing with a friend. Venting is like, I was stressed and this happened and this happened and this happened. Like, that's what my mom does. This happened and this happened and this happened, as opposed to this happened and I felt this way, and that was a really big reaction for what happened. And I think it's because, that's what processing looks like. Journaling can do the same thing. And again, it's not like Dear Diary, this happened today, but this happened today and this is how I felt about it. It's essentially doing the same thing instead of with a friend or, a colleague, but with yourself. Meditating, again, is another way that you can really just like calm your mind. And sometimes what meditation does is, if there's dust and debris in your emotional life, in your world, and you can't really see through it, meditating takes everything back down and it settles on the ground, and you can evaluate what is going on here. Where do we even begin? But if everything's up and you can't see through the cloud, all that stuff. So meditating can help with that. Physical movement, again, getting your energy out. Also physical movement's great because it increases your endorphins and it can bring up your motivation to a point that you want to be able to problem solve. You want to be able to take care of something. And, exercise can be really, really helpful. And also with the way that like chemically in your body, you're processing your exercise, like metabolizing, the way that that your brain is being fed also can really help to do the same thing that meditation does, like sort of settle the dust. And then problem solving. Problem solving is my favorite way of coping. Like, oh, there's a problem. Oh, I'm stressed. Like, I am going to figure this problem out. I think that's how Healthy Poor started, actually. Like, I'm stressed out. How do I fix this? Like, what can I do to fix this, to cope with the stressful situation of the hospitality industry? So different coping skills might come into play at different times. Some things might work for you, some might not. Like meditating might be your thing. It's not my thing. Maybe it's going to be my thing someday. I don't know. Also, your coping strategies are going to change throughout your life as well. Something might work for a while, but also I want to come back to like coping maladaptively. Sometimes that glass of wine and Love is Blind, it's just going to get you to the point that you can problem solve. So be compassionate with yourself. But if we could go to the next slide, actually, because it's my unintentional segue was so good. If you keep running into the same stressor over and over again, it's an indication that you're not coping adaptively with it. So if every night is a glass of wine and Love is Blind, and you're still stressed and you still wake up with anxiety, there's something that you're missing. So solid indicator right there. Okay, we can go to the
we're going to run another poll.
Oh, yeah.
The next poll before we move on. So I think this one, now that you've heard so much about different kinds of coping skills and mechanisms and different ways to cope, I think this question is perfectly timed before we move into the next topic, which is burnout. I also feel like this question, like the answers will change so much depending on when you ask it. If you ask me a certain day or certain week, a certain day, time of the day, my answers would be different. So curious to hear how y'all are feeling in this moment. How satisfied are you?
Hassel, I'm just giving it an extra moment because we've still got quite a few that need to answer.
No problem at all.
Great.
Oh, great.
That's awesome.
Kind of split down the middle, huh? Almost split down the middle.
I will say too that like people who come to seminars about mental health, are usually not as afraid of the conversation and have already dealt with it in a lot of ways. So as surprised as I might be to see like nearly satisfied and very satisfied, I also have to remind myself like, oh yeah, that is like also those are the people who come to presentations about mental health.
So bravo to all of you.
Yeah, I love it.
You're all so, yeah, don't stop, and you're all so doing such a great example of being proactive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, big topic here. Big topic. Burnout. We hear this again. It's another one of those words. You hear it every day. It gets thrown around like it's just, you know, another breath. And I have, you know, I have so many feelings when I hear the word burnout because, well, first of all, full transparency, I have experienced burnout. You know, and so it always reminds me of that experience. But I think it's a very misunderstood term.
Mm-hmm.
I think so often it's still associated with a moral failure, you know, with something you didn't do well. So Laura, you have a definition of burnout. I'm going to let you start with, and then I will add something after.
Yeah, so burnout is, first of all, it's a syndrome. And it's different from stress because stress is something that comes on quickly. Like, again, you see a bear and you have a stress response. Burnout is a much slower, insidious, and gradual process. And it's not the same as stress. They're related, and there is some overlap. Like, prolonged stress can cause burnout. But burnout is a syndrome of when you are essentially putting out more emotionally than you're getting back. So it's also, you know, sometimes I argue that we can use burnout and emotional exploitation interchangeably because there's more coming out. I'm giving more emotional life to this than I'm getting back from different forms of like different levels of support and stuff. And we'll talk about social support in a bit. But it's not burnout. What burnout is not is I'm stressed all the time and I'm tired. I'm exhausted. Like, exhaustion is part of it. And actually with that, actually, Hassel, can you speak a little bit to like the environment of burnout before we go into the stages of burnout?
Yes. So this is the piece where I feel like we get confused. So by definition, as Laura said, burnout is the result of environmental factors. The World Health Organization classifies it actually as an occupational phenomenon. It cannot just be reduced to solely our own doing to ourselves. That's not how that works. One of my favorite studies that I've ever read on burnout was this study by Gallup that highlighted 5 factors that lead to burnout. So I also like to call them, also known as 5 factors that leaders should focus on to reduce burnout. So number 1 is unfair treatment at work. Number 2 is unmanageable workload. Number 3 is lack of role clarity. Number 4 is lack of communication and support from superiors. Number 5 is unreasonable time pressure. Now, this is not just for employees. Obviously, this affects leaders as well. The only difference, though, is that when you're in a leadership position, when you're the employer, when you own the place, you have more agency to make changes in the workplace because you're in a leadership position. When you're an employee, a lot of those decisions are out of your hands. And so you're at the mercy of these 5 factors that I just highlighted. So I really think it's important to get really clear on burnout if you're an employer, if you're in a leadership position, if you have influence over how decisions are made in the workplace, because you can really impact someone's experience and you can also contribute to the prevention of burnout.
Yeah, and to that, I'll add that, you know, we often see these articles of like how to reduce burnout, and it's all these lists of things that like individuals can do to treat it. That's not it. Like, that's definitely not it. Burnout can only be treated by changing the environment or like, so gosh, I read an article, a study about burnout that determined that the only way to actually treat burnout is to like leave your job. And that sucks, like, especially when you own your job, when your job is a company that you own. You know, and in that sense, the treatment becomes really changing how things are run, like very systemic operational changes. So another way to think about burnout is that you are putting out more than you think is going to do something. And that is hard. And especially in a time like this, when there's so much uncertainty, there's so much like throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks. It's the perfect recipe for burnout of like, I'm just going to keep spinning my wheels and trying new things, but nothing's working. And that's when we start to burn out, because, and I hope you can recognize that that's an emotional process that's sort of demoralizing, like, oh my God, I wish I could find it, but forever ago, I read a definition of burnout by a Stanford psychologist. I can't remember who it was. I can't find it. I've looked for it, but she said it was the erosion of the soul. And I was like, ooh, that's brutal. So it takes passion and turns it into the erosion of the soul. So be mindful of that. And kind of going back to what Hassel said earlier in our presentation about, you know, do what you love and you won't work a day in your life. That's how we get burned out, is doing something that we love, but not having any boundaries around it. Because then it does become spinning our wheels. You know, from a personal level, I toe the line of burnout all the time, you know, and Hassel, I think you can agree with me, because we're trying to make an impact, tremendous change in the industry, talk about mental health. And sometimes it's like, is it happening? And so there's all this emotional stuff coming out of us, you know, like, you know, in work, but is it having an impact? And so it toes the line of burnout, which I think is a great segue into talking about the stages of burnout, and how it comes on, and the intervention points as well. So the next slide details that for us. Perfect. So burnout, yes.
One quick thing before you jump in, Laura. I think we were going to ask that burnout question twice. So did we want to run the poll now?
Yeah.
Before you go into this? Yes. Because I am curious to get this answered before you walk us through all of the specifics, before we ask it again after. You know, I think now that we've, yeah, of course. I think now that we've defined it, it's easier to answer this question as well.
Yep, there it is. Oh, God. Yeah, burnout
is the hospitality sector.
Burnout is definitely a thing, and I think burnout is also one of the main factors when we talk about the turnover issues we're seeing in our industry. You know, if the treatment of burnout is a new environment, it makes sense that people leave often, right? And that's like a hard reality to really look at. But so the stages of burnout, the other treatment of burnout is for the Titanic to not sink at all. The idea to intervene very early and intervene often. It's just like voting in Chicago, early and often. So the three stages of the 3 stages of burnout.
The next slide. I think we can look at the next slide before you start talking, just so that everyone can read them as you go through them. Can we change to the next slide?
That it has changed on my end.
Whoa.
I'll try again, ladies.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Is this the one?
We're still seeing the poll.
I'm still seeing the poll as well.
Ah, okay. One moment. Apologies, ladies.
Oh, good. There we go. Perfect.
There you go.
We just go one back to exhaustion, cynicism, and efficacy. That sounds so terrible. Welcome to my life.
Up again.
Oh, two more back to the green slide.
This one.
Perfect. Yes.
Okay.
The three
I'm holding
stages of all good. The three stages of burnout are exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy. So exhaustion is when we have that sort of chronic stress or that episodic stress that we're just like tired. When you see the visual of like burning the candle at both ends, that's exhaustion. The next phase that we move into is cynicism. And another way we talk about this is dehumanization. So it's when we start to turn our employees into just numbers on a spreadsheet, or people become very disposable to us. Like I teach bartenders about burnout, recalling my experience as a bartender of when I would see the nicest, kindest couple walk in and I'd be like, get out of my bar. Like I would want nothing to do with them. And I hated them, And when that happened, I was like, oh, I'm getting cynical. It's when people start to get bitter, or they think that things will never change, or they can't impact change. And I hope, talking specifically about the cynicism and the dehumanization, when we talk about burnout being sort of an emotional exhaustion of not seeing progress, and to Hassel's point of what she said of like when we don't have clear job descriptions or goals, that we're just working into the ether and into the nothingness without any sort of like attention or reward or acknowledgement, people will start to get cynical. We're seeing that a lot in the pandemic as people are moving in and out of all of these different regulations and standards and stuff, that they're just like, oh my God, I keep doing it, but nothing's changing. I keep wearing my mask, but we still are told to wear, I got my vaccine, whatever that is. People are getting cynical and it shows. And then the last phase of burnout is inefficacy. And that's when we really start sucking at our job, when we are working 80 hours, but getting the equivalent of 20 hours of work done, when we are like just kind of spinning our wheels and we're slow and we don't respond to emails. And I'm not speaking from experience. I am. I'm definitely speaking from experience, that we just start to really slow down and we're not as productive in the way that makes us feel good, that kind of productivity that empowers us. In terms of intervention points of where we want to intervene, it's exhaustion. If you're exhausted, like that's, you're on the road to get there. And that's where the stress overlaps. The cynicism though, if you hit the point of cynicism, like red flag, red flag, red flag, because you can still come back from cynicism. Maybe, I am like thinking of a few people in particular that I'm like, well, they never came back from cynicism. But those are the times where we have to intervene. And intervention doesn't look like taking 2 weeks off of vacation. Have you ever experienced that thing where you like go on vacation, you're like, I just need to like recoup and drink a Mai Tai, and not even a good Mai Tai. I want the bad Mai Tai on the beach and it's going to taste delicious anyway. But then you come back to work and you just fall right back into that same sort of like angry space, that cynical space. That's burnout. Like what you're experiencing is burnout, and no amount of vacation is going to fix that. It has to be a systemic environmental change. So let's go ahead to the next slide then, because framing it in this way I find to be really helpful. So burnout happens when demands made on us outweigh the resources we have to address them. This is based on a organizational theory called job demands and resources theory, that they say causes burnout. And it's become my favorite theory associated with burnout, because the job demands are the stresses and the work, the amount of work that we have to do. And the resources aren't like sheets of paper or whatever. The resources are actually social support, stress management skills, emotional intelligence skills, leadership support. Those are the resources we're looking at, and those are the things that really impact and prevent burnout. So with this too, before we go to, before I hand it over to Hassel, with this, oh wait, it just went from my brain. Oh no, my brain's doing that thing. Job demands. Oh, this is when we see, when we have adequate resources to address the job demands, that's when we see people who are in incredibly high stress positions or like life or death situations still like going to like the neighbor's barbecue and just like feeling great. You know, we can endure quite a lot of stress if we have the resources to support it. But if we don't have the resources to support it, that's when we burn out. So in terms of like overall treatment, what we're looking at is turning the volume up and increasing our resource and our capacity to accept those resources. Okay, I'll hand it over to you, Hassel.
I did want to just highlight as well, there's 15 more minutes. We have 2 more slides, but if you did have questions for us, probably a good time to throw them in the chat now. Make sure you write them in and we will make sure to answer them for you. So the last thing I wanted to just highlight on burnout, which I think often goes unsaid, unfortunately, is the difference that exists for those of us who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Those of us in these different communities oftentimes have different lived experiences and have different stressors and have, you know, daily microaggressions, have, you know, a lot of comments constantly made that affect us in different ways. And I think harmful industry expressions like leave your personal life at the door, or how I used to hear it was check your shit at the door. I was constantly told this as a server or host or bartender or manager, or to be honest, even when I owned the place. I used to own a restaurant and I was still told this by other people. It's not a realistic thing to ask of someone. I can't divorce myself from being a woman of color, and no one can divorce themselves from their identity. It's also, you know, this like emphasis to conform to white supremacist norms that just causes harm to everyone. It destroys psychological safety, and it definitely can lead to burnout. When you are in an environment where you don't feel supported and when these external factors are constantly challenging your mental well-being on a daily basis, you know, you have to acknowledge that this makes a difference. When these factors go unacknowledged and unaddressed, there is harm, and that harm is deplorable. So I think, you know, the last thing I'll say on this is just that this is where like lack of representation and awareness is really important, especially with industry leadership, because it perpetuates this expectation. You know, representation matters. For me, seeing other women of color in leadership positions was incredibly important for me to feel like I could one day become a leader myself. And failure to recognize this, you know, and our role in all of this, you know, just continues that systemic oppression on everyone's mental health. Like Laura said, there is so much in terms of leadership accountability and systemic change that is needed to prevent burnout, that I always feel like it's important to verbally acknowledge this as well. I think we can go to the next slide, where we get into the social support. So I think before I hand it off to you, Laura, I just want to highlight here in terms of social support, you know, so often we do go at it alone, especially if you're a leader, if you're an owner operator, if you manage a team by yourself and you're at the top, like I was saying earlier, the brigade system, we so often delude ourselves into thinking that we can do everything alone. And I can tell you this is something I've struggled with a lot in my career. This is where I hold myself accountable as a leader, that delegating, you know, learning to share the load, learning to make systemic change within my organization, constantly reminding myself that I need resources too. It's not just for my team and everyone else around me. You know, I need to acknowledge what my coping skills are. I need clear guidelines on my role. You know, a clarity of roles, as we said, is one of the burnout factors. That applies to leaders as well. So I think so oftentimes we think of these things as like, oh, it's for them. It's for the kids. It's for the team. It's for the workers. And, you know, it's just not true. Sorry to hold a mirror up, but it's just as important for you as it is for them.
And I was muted.
Go to the, oh, you were muted. Okay, I was gonna say you can add to that, or we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, I mean, and we can actually go ahead to the next slide, because I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of social support. In the literature, in the research, again and again and again, social support, social support, social support, it mitigates burnout. There was a study in 2010 specifically about chefs that the role of social support was a massive mitigating factor of the burnout experience, you know, and also decreased retention. You know, but also when we have social support, we're social beings, but that increases our well-being, and our well-being is also then correlated with things like retention, productivity. You know, it also improves engagement. So when we have workplaces that have social support, and when I mean social support, I'm not just talking about like your team gets along with each other. I'm talking about they help each other. They're not cutthroat to get a certain section, or managers aren't pitted against each other for their goals, or to get their bonuses or whatever. That shifts in scheduling for managers as well is fair and equitable, that people aren't just being tossed into like the bad shifts. Been there. It sucks, you know. So it's social support combined with supervisory support, peer support, and organizational support, all rolled together. It's really where it's where it is. So doing things like reducing our employees to just disposable numbers isn't going to, first of all, help your organization, but it's also like not going to help you, because that dehumanizing bit also is going to accelerate any sort of burnout process that you're coming through. If we can foster connection, there's also really great research that when we have feelings of connection, that it decreases our substance use, which is really interesting. Like lots of really good stuff around social support. I want to add too, I'm not talking about like we're a family here kind of social support. I'm not talking about that sort of like we're a family, do what I say type thing. I'm talking about like we all have shared values. We all are supporting each other. We are working towards a common goal together, and we are all contributing, and we all matter. You know, I have feelings about using the term family in the workplace, but I want to say too that just because we really shouldn't be calling each other family in the workplace, we are colleagues, that doesn't mean we don't care for each other. You can care for people and not refer to them as family. Our family is our family, and people have complicated relationships with family. That's not what the workplace is about. So I think we can go to the next slide. Hassel, unless you wanted to add something to this.
Nope, we can go to the next slide. And also, can we run the last poll before we jump? This is our last slide. So before we wrap that up, would be very curious to hear if you seek out social support when you're feeling overwhelmed. I find that sometimes, you know, some of us as leaders, we do lean, we do seek and accept help, but a lot of us have been having to do a lot of unlearning around that. So conditioned to go at it alone.
I'm personally just terrible about it. I have to be reminded by friends and colleagues of like, you cannot be a silo. So I get it. Cool. I love that. I'm so glad.
This is a really cool group. I wish I could see all of your faces, but you're all amazing, and that's very impressive. Okay, so last slide, so we can let you get back to your day. We have 5 more minutes. The last slide on social support. I'm still seeing the poll.
Oh, perfect. Oh, what? Yeah, there we go. Wonderful. So ways to increase social support, and this is something that you can do for yourself, but also integrate into your organization. Being inclusive, creating a system of feedback and input for all members of your team. And, you know, this is also a way to increase psychological safety, that everybody's contributing, everyone is heard, you know, looking around the room. And if somebody's not there, if everybody looks the same, or everyone comes from the same place or same socioeconomic status, you might want to be like, there's something, just like your stress, like, oh, I see something to fix here. You know, knowledge sharing. These next two, knowledge sharing and delegating, these are hard. Okay, I just want to preface it. And these are like long-term things. Knowledge sharing is important, and teaching people how to do our jobs. Sometimes we don't want to do that because we're afraid that we're replaceable or we won't matter anymore. We want to have our hands in everything, and, you know, we want to control everything, and we're really afraid to like loosen the grip on some stuff. But knowledge sharing, training people how to support us, is really, really important, so that also we can take a step away, so that we can turn our brains off. If we want to take like 2 days away from the restaurant or from whatever it is that you're working on, your property, that you know that you can turn your brain, you can be like, I am not in work time anymore. I'm in my lifetime. I am with my family, or I'm with my friends, or I'm wherever you are, you know, that you don't have to still be at work even when you're not at work. Delegating is along the same lines of knowledge share. If you can't complete what you need to do, I want to say 40 hours, y'all, but realistically, if you can't complete what you need to do in 50 or 60 hours, you have to start delegating. Give it to somebody. And I guarantee that between knowledge sharing and delegating, there's somebody in your organization that wants to learn how to do that. So that also becomes a form of career development, which also increases well-being and retention and engagement. Even when people are planning on leaving the industry, they stay longer. So keeping that in mind, it is a little bit of work on the front end to get to that knowledge sharing and delegating, because you have to teach. And that's the brutal part. Like, from experience, that is the brutal part. But once you can get a system of that moving, it's worth it. It's just like when you start to work out at 5 a.m. You just little itty bitty bits at a time, coming back to the beginning. And then the last thing is to be vulnerable. Don't silo yourself. Being vulnerable with your team doesn't mean coming and like spewing your trauma or even all of your feelings all over the place, but sometimes saying like, this has been really hard. I see how hard this is for you. This is also really hard for me, and I want you to know that you are not alone in these feelings. That's really important. And you can be vulnerable with your team, but also being vulnerable with peers who are in the same situation as you, other restaurant owners, operators, you know, not even restaurant owner, just small business or small medium enterprises, whatever, like whoever aligns with you, just connecting with them in a way that's real. Like, something I'd like to say, like on my Instagram account, is all these Instagrams have all these women being like, oh, you know, girl boss, small business owner, and they're drinking their iced coffees. And I'm like, no, it's over here. It's terrible. It's really hard. Like, it is so hard. But that vulnerability is what allows us to connect. And living in the reality of it is what allows us to actually start addressing the things that we need to address so that it's better. Hassel, do you have anything to add to that? I'm sure you do. I hope you do.
All of that. Yes to all of that. I love that so much. I think the vulnerability piece, the only thing I would add there is just that it's contagious. Really, really cool how that works. Vulnerability is contagious. When one person's vulnerable, it makes it easier and more likely that everyone around them will be vulnerable too. In terms of questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat, or if you go to the next slide, we are sharing our email addresses. So if you want to reach out to us and you don't want to ask a question in the chat, and you feel like, yeah, well, maybe I'll be vulnerable, but it doesn't mean I have to be vulnerable in front of a group of people. I get that. I'm like that. So I see you. Email me, email Laura, email both of us. I think, you know, it's really, really important to ask questions if you don't know what to do. And the last thing I'll end on is that workplace mental health is a very new topic for this industry. We've been neglecting it for centuries. So it took us a long time to get here. It's going to take us a long time to get out. And it's okay that if you don't know how to, move forward with certain conversations, or how to do half the things we talked about today. That's very natural and very normal and understandable. So with that, I thank you for your time. I'll pass it back to Lori.
Thank you very much, ladies. What a great discussion. Some great points. There are some questions. Pardon me. There are questions regarding some of the slides, and what I will say to everyone is the presentation will be available on our website, rto9.ca, under past presentations, as well as the handouts, which are, I think we have 5 of them in total that will be available there as well. So the first question we've got is, Laura, I love your hair length.
Got so bad. Oh my God. To the point that my stylist like Instagrammed me like, hey, how you doing? And I'm like, I know, but thank you.
Yeah, okay. So that wasn't really a question, more of a statement. Thank you for making that. So I have a question that came in. So as an owner manager, I can sometimes lose it in front of staff. How do I then go back to talk to my team about this?
That's your vulnerable opportunity. And, a few key points to make is that sort of emotional outburst is unacceptable and you regret it. And I would use those words, like that was not it, and you might want to explain also, like, I was in a really stressful situation. It doesn't excuse it. But that is the repercussion of me not managing my stress effectively in the moment. And it's an opportunity to build a bridge of understanding with your staff. Like, it sucks to lose it in front of your staff. It sucks. And it doesn't feel good. And there's that whole like guilt and shame thing that creeps in after the fact. But putting it out all in the sunlight to be like, that wasn't it. I'm very, very sorry. If you want to talk to me more about it, like leave that open. Let people know that they can talk to you about it. But that vulnerable piece is so important, and acknowledging it as well. But the reality is that a lot of people lose it when they're stressed. And if we acknowledge it and put it in the sunlight, a lot of people who were around when they see that happen might be like, I lose it too. Dang. So it also models accountability and grace.
Okay, terrific. And a second question.
If I could just add one sentence, it's not what happens, it's how you handle it. I think that it's really, really important to acknowledge how you handle something, and that it not be handled the same way each time. Because if nothing changes, then nothing changes. So make sure that you're acknowledging it and that you're handling it, and that each time that there's more action towards a different outcome than just the repetition of just, I'm sorry each time.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, back to you, Lori.
If Gordon Ramsay said he was sorry after every time, no one would listen anymore. Would be like, bruh, no, you're just gonna keep yelling at me. I'm not an idiot sandwich.
Interesting. Okay, and then another question we have. Hopefully we're all coming out of this pandemic as we start to open up, but I'm looking back on the last 2 years and the challenges of being a leader and not being able to find staff and trying to keep my doors open. This has led to a lot of cynicism on my behalf. And the issue I have is I don't have time to stop and address it.
Yeah.
How do I find the time?
Okay, so I'll start with this one, Laura. I'm sure you'll have tons to add, but this is going to be a hard pill to swallow. The cost of doing nothing is everything. So if you do nothing, the potential cost is losing everything, losing your entire business as a whole. You can't not take the time. Even if you don't want to, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it hurts, even if that's not what you want to hear. There is no way around not addressing the cynicism as Laura mentioned earlier with burnout, you can come back from it. Requires a lot of discomfort and work, inner work primarily. But it is possible, you know, there is hope. And I know it feels like there's no time in the day. I know it feels like it's way too hard to do. And I know it feels like I just don't want to because that's real. But unfortunately, you know, in terms of keeping sustainable businesses going, it's really the only way is through.
Yeah, I'll just add to that like there is a painful catch-up period when you're making changes. Actually, before I even say that, most of what we're seeing in the data around labor says that what the labor market looks like right now is what it looks like. And again, sorry to be the bearer of bad news and like a hard pill to swallow, but the reality is that there aren't more people to find. And we are projecting right now that that's going to be probably for the next few years. So for all of you watching, in terms of labor and retention, things to think about is what happens when we never find anybody else, when our labor levels never increase, when we are never fully staffed. And taking this time, this is what I mean, like there's going to be a time of a little bit of overload until you can catch up, but you have to do it. You have to do it. It sucks. I feel it. It sucks. But trying to reimagine how your business can operate with the labor levels that you have. It's not just hospitality that's seeing this, it's all industries, because what we're seeing is that people, when they leave their jobs, they don't leave their job to go to another job, they leave their industry to go to a different industry. So there's a lot of change happening, but we're finding that people are where they are now. The change has already happened. So we're kind of reimagining what the workload is going to look like, how systems are operating. It's going to take a lot of creativity and reimagining on our part in this industry to think of how can we formulate how systems are working. But if we keep thinking that there's more people coming, you are just going to get more and more cynical. And so that front loaded work has to happen now. And like I said, it's going to suck, and it might be a lot of long days, and it might be a lot of failure to figure it out, of like trying new things and that not working. I think the best advice I can give in terms of resilience for that is to imagine what it's going to feel like when you're like, oh my God, we did it. You know, that's what I keep telling myself. Like I'm imagining myself 5 years from now on a panel being like, I told myself, just keep going. And, you know, so looking to the future and knowing that it's going to pay off. But if we avoid the reality of the situation, you're just going to get more and more cynical. And I'm so sorry you're going through that. I feel it. It sucks. And I wish I had more uplifting, Instagrammable advice. You know?
All right, I think that's it for questions. Ladies, we've gone over, and I appreciate you staying on, and everybody else who stayed on with us. I appreciate your insight, your experience on this really very important subject that has largely been ignored over the years. It's a lot more impactful coming from ladies like you, peers who have been in the industry and who actually understand the situations that arise that cause stress and burnout. There's so much we can learn and do as leaders to help ourselves, which in turn, of course, help our team. So just something else, we do have a second webinar with Hassel and Laura on April 11th that focuses on recognizing and helping your employees, your team, to manage their mental health, which is equally as important. You can find more information if you follow us on our social channels, so Facebook or Instagram, or if you receive our newsletter from our website, again, rto9.ca. So ladies, I want to thank you again. This has been a great discussion, really helpful for me, even though I'm not in the industry anymore, because some of those same sorts of approaches to stress and burnout, of course, can be applied to any job. So I appreciate everyone joining today. Ladies, I'll see you on the 11th. And
I know that, but I just want to say one more thing. Your mental because I kind of feel bad about how I answered that last question, and I want to be clear of something. Your mental health at the end of the day is paramount. As much as we want to preserve our businesses and as much as we want to preserve the industry because we love it, your mental health and well-being is the most important thing every single day. So I don't ever want you to think that you need to sacrifice your well-being. Like, you might have to walk through some fire a little bit, but like, you know, if it gets to the point that it's always okay to walk away because your well-being and your safety is the most important thing. Just wanted to say that because I wanted to be clear.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And on that note, we will say goodbye to everybody and thank you once again for joining us today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.